And welcome back, everybody. Welcome to our winter semester of our formerly Lunch and Learn Wednesday class, and now it's called the Wednesday Afternoon Study Group. And that's because you're supplying yourself with your own lunch. We look forward to the day, hopefully sooner than later, that you can all join me back in the room so we can serve lunch after class is over. We will be keeping it on Zoom as well for all of our new students throughout the world that are joining us for our classes. We're going to be studying this semester from chapter 10, verse 12 of the portion of Akev. It's a very powerful section. We'll get to it a little bit later after my introduction. It's part of the fifth book of the Bible. The fifth book of the Bible in Hebrew is called the book of Devarim. Devarim means words. We'll get to that in a moment soon. In Latin and Greek, the word is Deuteronomy. So you may have heard that word before. And the entire fifth book of the Bible is a very powerful address by Moses, literally days before his passing. And you have to think of it that way as we're going to study the text together. Understand, you're hearing this from Moses, in which he has hours left to live on this world. And what he utilizes these speeches in the last week of his life is to deliver a mission statement to the Jewish people. And it's his final plea to the Jewish people to keep the torch of Judaism aflame and to see to it that it gets passed along, and all of its teachings and all of its laws and all of its understanding from one generation to the next. I want to add parenthetically that the very fact that we're together now, whether you're with me on Zoom, you're with me on Facebook, or you're going to be with me on YouTube, the very fact that we are studying the text of the Torah today, in the year 2021, 3,333 years after it was given, is a tribute to the success of the book of Deuteronomy, of Moses' plea to that generation to see to it that the Torah lives on. And we're able to answer Moses and say, Moses, it has lived on. We still study it word for word. We delve into it. We live with it. So simply us being here is a powerful response to Moses' reading of the book of Deuteronomy to us 3,333 years ago. We're answering him. And in this book, Moses will review some of the laws that were already covered in the first book. He'll introduce some laws that we have not yet discussed in the first four books. And he'll remind them of the particular challenges and, yes, rebellions experienced during the past 40 years, the lows and the highs. Moses understood that once they crossed over that Jordan River, life was going to be very different. The people would no longer see God's constant presence as they did for these 40 years. They will no longer see the daily miracles as they did in the wilderness. They would need to plow and plant and harvest, something they didn't have to do in the wilderness. They would establish courts and governments. They would forge social relationships and find the means to provide for and protect their families, the needy, the helpless. None of that existed for the 40 years in the wilderness. They were all provided for. No one was lacking because the manna fell from heaven every single day. They would need strong faith and self-discipline to avoid the temptations of the pagan neighbors and the ways of life left over by the Canaanite population into the land that they were entering. They would need to avoid false prophets. They would need to avoid idol worship. They would need to be strong because they're going to have some neighbors that don't like them. They're going to need to be resolute, and they're going to need to be determined. So imagine an address that you need to write to address everything I just mentioned. And it needs to inspire not just for a decade, not just for a century, not just for a millennia, but for an eternity. So thus, the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Devarim, is not merely a review or a summary of the previous 4 books. A review Moses did on a regular basis, not just the week before his passing. This is different. This is his last will and testament, not just to the generation standing on the shores of the Jordan River about to enter the land of Israel for the first time, but it's his last will and testament to each and every generation to come thereafter. He is speaking to us today. And it's after he gives this speech that God instructs him to record it and write it word for word, and for this address to be included in the 5 books of Moses, making up the 5th of the 5 books, to become part of God's Torah, part of God's eternal teaching to the Jewish people and to the world. The book also has another name. It's called Mishneh Torah, and that loosely, but I would say poorly translated, as the repetition of the law. The word Deuteronomy itself, by the way, also means repetition of the law. Now, as I mentioned, there are parts of the book of Devarim, of the book of Deuteronomy, that are repeated parts from the first 4 books. There are stories that are repeated, there are laws that are repeated, but there's a lot of new narratives as well. You know, there are 70 new laws in the book of Deuteronomy that we do not have in the first 4 of the 5 books of Moses. Now, these 70 laws are not that the Jews are first getting them. They were taught all these commandments the first year after Sinai. But this is the first time it's actually recorded in the Torah. And when Moses repeats the story, he repeats it from his narrative. He repeats it from the way he experienced it. And so it's slightly different from the way we have it recorded in the first 4 books. So the idea of the book of Deuteronomy being this repetition is not a good translation, because it's not a repetition of the first 4 books. And to back up my claim that the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, is not simply what we used to call in high school, how many of you remember the words cliff notes? Remember, we had cliff notes. We would go and buy the summary of A Tale of Two Cities or Moby Dick or any stories that we were working on that would help us with our assignments. Or if we never wanted to read the full story, we would just read the cliff notes. So to back up my claim that Deuteronomy is not the cliff notes of the first 4 books, I want to take a closer look at this theory. And I'm going to ask you each to imagine that you are a teacher in school and you assign your class an assignment to summarize the first 4 books of the Bible. Okay, you give them that assignment. I want a summary of the first 4 books. And suppose your student hands in the book of Deuteronomy as his assignment, as his summary of the first 4 books. And you need to grade it. How would you grade the book of Deuteronomy if the assignment was for it to be a repetition, a summary of the first 4 books of the Bible? So you would start your grading process by saying, if I'm asking the students to summarize 4 books, each summary of each book would be worth how many points? Do the math, 25 points. So it's 25 points per book. Let's take a look. You start with the book of Genesis, the book of Bereshis, right? The book of Bereshis deals with the creation of the world, the flood, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel, and the story of Joseph. If you look throughout the entire book of Deuteronomy, There is not a single mention of creation, of the flood, of the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the tribes of Israel, and Joseph. So you would have to start by minus 25. You get no points for the book of Genesis if you're looking at the book of Deuteronomy as its summary. Let's look at the book of Exodus. We find a few details of the Exodus in the book of Deuteronomy, but not the whole elaborate story of the 10 plagues and the crossing, the splitting of the sea. We find no details in the book of Deuteronomy about the construction of the tabernacle, which takes up quite a few portions of the book of Exodus. We do find in the book of Deuteronomy the story of Mount Sinai and the golden calf. So if we were going to be generous with our student, at most we can give them 15 points for their summary of the book of Exodus, minus another 10. If we look into the book of Leviticus, the book of Vayikra, the book of Deuteronomy makes no mention of anything discussed in the book of Leviticus. So minus another 25 points. And then we'll look at the book of Numbers. Some of the stories of the book of Numbers are mentioned in the book of Deuteronomy. The stories of the spies are mentioned. The defeating of Sichon and Og are mentioned. But none of the mitzvot that are mentioned in the book of Numbers are repeated in the book of Deuteronomy. Again, if we want to be liberal, we'll give them 15 points for it. But that's it. So our student fails miserably by handing in the book of Deuteronomy and saying this is a summary of the first 4 books of the Bible. At most, they're going to get 30 points for it. That's it. Furthermore, as I mentioned, the book of Devarim, the 5th book of the 5 books of Moses, contains many mitzvot, 70, I told you, which were never mentioned earlier in the first 4 books. So I conclude then that the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy that we will be focusing on for the next few years, is not a review of the first 4 books. Why then is it called Mishnah Torah? Why then is it called repetition of the Torah? Why is it called Deuteronomy, the repeat of the Torah? And I submit to you that it doesn't mean the repetition of the first 4 books. It means the part of Torah that needs to be repeated over and over and over. It's the part of Torah that needs a daily reminder. Every day we need to look into the book of Deuteronomy to remind ourselves who we are, what we are, why we are. It doesn't take away the need to look into the first 4 books as well. In fact, it's that 5th book that will inspire us to continue going back to those first 4 books. See, as I mentioned, the word of Devarim means in Hebrew, words. It's a book of speeches. It's a book of speeches given by one man. These are the words. These are the speeches which Moses spoke to all of Israel in the 40th year on the first day of the 11th month. In Arvat Moav, Moshe began to explain the Torah, saying, thus begins the book of Deuteronomy. So it begins a month before his passing, and he continues it literally up until the moment of his passing. And you can see the change in style as the book is introduced to us. It then immediately switches as the Torah is now written in first person. And so Moses is speaking directly to them. He says, and these words that I am teaching you today must be kept in your heart. Vishinantam, and you must repeat them over and over to your children and speak about them constantly when at home, when you travel, when you get up in the morning, and when you go to sleep. In other words, the set of mitzvot recorded in this central presentation of this book are special insofar as they must constantly be repeated and taught. That's why it's called Mishnah Torah. You see, this book crystallizes for us what it means to be a member of the chosen people. What does it mean? They're nice poetic words, chosen people. But what does it really mean? And how does it affect me? And how should it affect my life? It defines also so clearly the Jewish definition of leadership, which is going to be so critical throughout our history, to understand the meaning of a leader, the role of a leader, the responsibility of a leader. See, by the end of the book of Numbers, Numbers is the fourth of the 5 books of Moses, Moses' career as a leader seems to have come to an end. He had already appointed his successor, Joshua, and it would be he, Joshua, not Moses, who would lead the people across the Jordan into the promised land. Moses seems to have achieved everything that he was destined to achieve. From here, there would be no more battles to fight, no more miracles to perform, no more prayers to make on behalf of the people. It's what Moses did next, after we believed and thought that his career was over, that bears the mark of greatness. Because for the last month of his life, he assembles the people and delivers this series of addresses we know as the book of Deuteronomy. And in these addresses, he links it all together, all the details of the law and the history into this single overreaching vision, I would say, overarching vision, in which he puts it all together. He packages it for us. And he explains to us why we have to see ourselves as an Am Kadosh, as a holy people, the only people whose sovereign and lawgiver was God himself. So if someone knew nothing about Judaism and knew nothing about the Jewish people, were to ask you for a single book that will explain both who Jews are and why they do what they do, and you would have limited to one book, the best answer would be the book of Deuteronomy, because no other book so encapsulates and dramatizes all the key elements of Judaism as a faith and as a way of life and as a mission statement. In Deuteronomy, Moses gives the people their why. They are God's people, the nation on whom he has set his love, the people he rescued from slavery and gave in the form of the commandments, the constitution of liberty. And yes, they may be small, and they will always be small, but they are unique. They are the people who in themselves testify to something beyond themselves. No other people has that. They are the people whose fate will defy the normal laws of history. Other nations, says Moses, will recognize the miraculous nature of the Jewish story. And any honest nation, any honest people, any honest country throughout history has recognized that. And so in the last weeks of his life, he ceases to be Moses the liberator. He stops being Moses the miracle worker. He stops being Moses the redeemer. And what does he become? Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. His final mission in life is to be our teacher. And we remember him most by those words, Moshe Rabbeinu. It's the first such example, it's the first instance in history of a leadership type in which Jews have excelled the leader as a teacher. Think about it. Most countries, the leaders are presidents, they're generals, they're war heroes. Here, our leader is the one that teaches us. See, Moses knew that some of his greatest achievements would not last forever. that the people he had rescued would one day suffer exile again, and there would be persecution again. The next time, though, they wouldn't have a Moses to do miracles. There wouldn't be a 10 plagues. There wouldn't be a splitting of the sea. So what did he do? He planted a vision in our minds, a hope in our hearts, a discipline in our deeds, a strength in our souls that would never fade. You see, when leaders become educators, they change our lives, the lives of our children, the lives of our grandchildren for all eternity. So when we think about Jewish leadership, let's contrast the Torah perspective on royalty and teachers. The Torah places severe limits on the power of kings. They must not multiply in gold or wives or horses. A king is commanded not to consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, nor turn from the law to the right or to the left. That's also part of Deuteronomy. A king was only appointed at the request of the people. And according to the commentaries, the appointment of a king was permission, not an obligation. Some say it was a concession to human frailty. Some say it was regarded the existence of a king as a punishment, not as a reward. In short, Judaism is at best ambivalent about monarchy. It allows it, but it frowns on it. It doesn't love it. On the other hand, its regard for teachers is almost unlimited. I quote, "Let the fear of your teacher be as the fear of heaven," says the Talmud. Respect and reverence for your teacher should be greater even than the respect and reverence for your parents, says Maimonides, because parents bring you into this world while teachers bring you into the world to come. You see, when someone exercises power over us, he or she diminishes us. We become smaller because they have power over us. But when someone teaches us, he or she helps us grow. We become bigger. And that's why Judaism, with its acute concern for human dignity, favors leadership as education over leadership as power. And it begins with Moses, and it begins in the book of Deuteronomy. Teachers are the unacknowledged builders of the future. And if a leader wants to make a lasting change, he or she must follow in the footsteps of Moses and become an educator. The leader as teacher uses that influence, not the power, to build us up spiritually, intellectually, rather than by force, but by education, but by inspiration. And this is one of the greatest contributions Judaism ever made to the moral horizon of humankind. And it can be seen clearly in the book of Deuteronomy. When Moses, for the last month of his life, summons the next generation and taught them laws and lessons that would survive and inspire so long as they're human beings on earth, he taught us, if you really want to change the world, inspire them, teach them. Don't use power over them. The name of the portion that we're going to study in this semester, we're continuing it from last semester, is called by the name Akev. V'haya Akev Tishmon, says Moses, and it will come to pass. That's the literal translation of the word Akev. But the word Akev has another meaning in Hebrew. It means your heel, the bottom of your foot, your heel, that which you step on. And the commentaries explain that the opening verse of the portion that we will study is talking to us about keeping the commandments that we will generally step upon. The commandments that we think is not so important, that we trample on them. And I'll get back to this soon. We studied also in this portion that Moses reviewed with them, with this generation about to enter the promised land, the whole episode of the golden calf and the breaking of the tablets. Those of you who have been with me the last few months, we've studied Moses' review of the golden calf. We studied Moses' defense of the Jewish people in the story of the golden calf. We studied the breaking of the first tablets. And we studied that when Moses came down the mountain and he saw the calf, he broke the tablets, he threw it to the ground. And then we studied Moses begging God once again for forgiveness. And then we studied that God tells Moses to prepare a second set of tablets, a second set of stone, to bring the second set up on top of Mount Sinai, and that God would write on that second set of tablets the same 10 commandments that were on the original commandments that Moses broke. And the words of the text of the Torah say, carve for yourself 2 stone tablets. God says to Moses, carve for yourself 2 stone tablets, bring it up the mountain, and I'll write on them. And the commentaries are always sensitive to every word, to every nuance. And it asks the question, what did God mean when he said, carve for yourself? Why not just carve 2 stone tablets? What's that word lecha, for yourself, doing in that verse? And the Talmud answers the question. And the Talmud says a very strange thing. The Talmud says, carve for yourself means that Moses benefited from the carving. For yourself, that he himself benefited from this. How did he benefit from the carving of the stone? Says the Talmud. As he's carving the stone, there are chips that you carve out, right? So there's parts of the stone as you're chipping away. That God told Moses that the chips of the stone that you are carving are for yourself. You can keep it. And it was extremely valuable chips. The stone was very valuable. And therefore the chips had tremendous value. And Moses became an extremely wealthy man because God allowed him to keep the chips of the tablets that he was carving for the second set of the 10 commandments to be written on. That's what the Talmud says. It's rather strange. Moses, you can get a cut out of this? Is that the way we see Moses here? Right? You're going to get a bonus from this? It seems almost a bit distasteful. It flies against everything that we have studied about Moses, and Moses giving himself completely over. They hear God saying, here, Moses, do the work, but I'm going to pay you well for it because all those chips, it belongs to you, and you're going to become very, very wealthy. So Moses is making money off the sacred tablets containing the 10 commandments. If God wanted Moses to be wealthy, he could have found many ways to pay Moses a very nice salary. Why through the carving of the holy tablets? Besides, let's be practical for a moment. What's Moses going to do with the wealth? You're living in the desert. There's no stores. There's no furniture to buy. There's no vacation to take. There's no savings account to put it in. There's no automobile to buy. What does Moses need wealth for? You're living in the desert for your entire life. You're going nowhere, but you're remaining in a desert. You can't even buy food at Ralph's. The manna and the water comes from heaven. Moses, I'm going to reward you with wealth by you being able to keep the chips of the tablets. What is Moses going to send it to some Swiss account to keep for a rainy day? And why was this so important that God wanted Moses to be wealthy from the chips? So it's in every story of the Bible, and this we're studying also Monday evenings. We have a course called the Biblical Reflections, where we focus on the stories of the Bible, because there's so much in the stories of the Bible that the Bible is trying to transmit to us. There's so much really going on in this story that's not in the literal sense that Moses was going to collect these chips and he's going to become wealthy from it. There's a teaching, there's a lesson in this story. Let me give you two examples of what we learned from this story. Many businesses have major expense accounts, and they also have what they would call a petty cash account, and that's for small expenditures. A good company, a healthy company, is very careful over that account of the small expenditures. Because if that gets under control, it affects the bottom line of the health, the financial health of the whole company. So negligence when it comes to the petty cash fund could sometimes run the company into serious financial difficulties. It's how you control the small that will define how well your company is doing. The tablets containing the 10 Commandments, which in reality represents all 613 mitzvot of the Torah. Among the mitzvot of the Torah, if I were to ask you to define what are the big ones and what are the small ones? From the 613, what do you consider the biggies? And what are those that are not so important? Every one of you listening would answer the question differently. Every one of you has your own opinion as to what's considered the big and what's considered the small. You define it yourself. You may have reasons for this definition. It may be that this is what your grandmother, your grandfather, your parents told you was critical. It may be that you studied somewhere that this was one of the most important principles, and therefore for you, that's very important. It may be just that you enjoy it more. It may be that you understand it better. Well, whatever the reason may be, we each have defined in our own mind in the 613 what's critically important and what's the petty cash account. What do we put into that account that, it's for the small stuff? So many people look at Torah and they have within Torah the parts of the Torah that are the precious stones, and then there are the chips, the pieces that get carved out. The mitzvot you perhaps chip away and fall to the ground. The ones that you don't see that has such value. The part of the story of Moses and the chips is that the chips of the tablets are symbolic of the often neglected mitzvot, the mitzvot we allow to fall to the ground. Think about it. A common cause for the ailment of the feet is poor circulation, because the foot is the part of the body furthest from the heart. Thus, the feet are often the first to suffer from inadequate blood supply due to circulatory problems, especially in its smaller veins and capillaries. And this physical phenomenon has its counterpart in the spiritual life of man, which depends on the lifeblood of the soul. And that's the Torah, the mitzvot, for its vitality and its health. So often we tend to distinguish between important mitzvot and lesser mitzvot. The same person who can be outraged by an act of thievery, by an act of adultery, who would never think of eating pork, might transgress the prohibition against speaking ill of another, we call lashon hara, or saying a white lie, or being dishonest about $15. It may not appear that important to him. Others will never think about eating on Yom Kippur, but they have no problem insulting somebody because that's part of the chips of Judaism. It's not the critical part. But my friends, if a mitzvah is a divine commandment, that means it's an expression of the will of God, then the human mind can't really sit in judgment and appraise the true value of any mitzvah. We can look at it from our perspective as big and small. But if they're both the will of God, then they're both precious. then Moses pick up those chips and save them because there's tremendous value and wealth, not financial wealth for Moses. But Moses was being taught what to teach us about the value of what we might consider the small mitzvah. Is our observance of the mitzvot contingent on our subjective appreciation for its social value? If it's up to us to judge the mitzvah, so to say, then of course we're going to discriminate between greater and lesser. But if we have looked at Torah and said, this is godly, if we look at the mitzvot and we say, this is divine will, then we have to appreciate that what we might consider the chips can have the greatest value of them all, can be the most important of them all. I'll give you one other interpretation, and then I want to read to you the text that we're going to be focusing on. The second tablets could not be compared to the first tablets. The first set of tablets was created by God himself. The second set of tablets was created by a human being, by Moses. Remember, Moses carved out the stone into the tablets, and then God inscribed on them. But the first set of tablets, the tablets that Moses broke, that was created directly by God, prepared by God, all done by God. This reflected the different status of the Jewish people. Initially, the Jewish people, pre-sin of the golden calf, were heavenly, they were holy, they were pure, they were sacred. So they were capable of receiving the tablets created in heaven. But after they sinned with the golden calf, after they tasted sin of idol worship, after the corruption, after the spiritual failure, now they can only receive the second set of tablets, which were man-made. And in this process of rehabilitation, as we go through teshuvah and repentance, we rehabilitate ourselves spiritually. There is always a confrontation that we have with human failure, with darkness. And we have to deal with our weaknesses and we have to deal with our vulnerabilities. We're no longer in that clean, pristine state of heaven-like. We have what we call pisoles, which means sediments. We realize that within our soul now, within our body and soul, we have filth to deal with as well. We have inclinations that we never really thought that we would act upon. We bow to a golden calf. Comes the Torah and teaches us one of the most vital lessons in life. It's from the chips of the tablets that Moses acquired true wealth. The first tablets had no chips, no leftover pieces that would go to the garbage. They had no undesirable accessories. The second set of tablets, in contrast, had many chips, for they represented our confrontation with darkness, with addiction, with promiscuity, with insecurity, with shame. Those are the chips that the story is talking about. And our true wealth comes from the second set of tablets, from the light and truth that it generated when we confront our darkness and we transform it into light. You see, Judaism and Torah is not about perfection. Perfection is the first set of tablets. The battle of life, the battle that we experience, the battle with our own darknesses, the battle with our own inclinations, that's the second set of tablets. And that's what brings about those chips. And those chips bring about spiritual wealth. So don't fall into deep darkness when you confront the challenges in life. The opposite is true. That's where you're going to find true light. That's where you're going to find the ultimate holiness. And that's what Moses understood, and that's what Moses taught us. Don't look at any mitzvah as unimportant. It could be extremely important. And don't get depressed when you fail, when you sin. Find the strength within yourself to overcome it, to learn from the past, and stand up again. Judaism is not a one-time thing. Once you fail, you're out. No. It's an eternal battle. It's an eternal struggle. Until Mashiach will come, we will always have these battles, and there will always be those chips. Pick them up. Pick them up and treasure them and value them. I'll tell you a short story. It's a cute story. It's a young widow that came to the Baal Shem Tov. You may have heard me tell stories about the Baal Shem Tov. He's the founder of the Hasidic movement. He was a miracle worker. He had this vision of being able to see what was going on throughout the world and in the heavenly worlds. And this widow came crying to the Baal Shem Tov that she recently lost her husband. And now her young child, her only child, is lying gravely ill. And the doctors have given up hope. Please, Baal Shem Tov, please, Rebbe, do something to save my child. So the Baal Shem Tov, whose heart was always open, especially to the needy and to the oppressed, especially here a widow, says, you go home, your child will be fine. I will pray to God to see to it that healing comes to your child. You spend time with your child. And then he proceeded to gather together 10 of the holiest tzaddikim of our time. He brings together this minion of 10 super righteous people to pray for the child's welfare and immediate healing, thinking for sure, if I gather together these 10 holy people and we pray to God for the healing of this child, certainly it's going to work. But to his shock and to his dismay, to no avail. As much as they tried opening their souls and to open the gates of heaven, sadly, they were unsuccessful. And the Baal Shem Tov sensed that the decree in heaven was sealed and couldn't be reversed by their prayers. They couldn't break through. But the Baal Shem Tov was not one to take no for an answer and give up. And he came up with an idea. And he asked his wagon driver to prepare the wagon, and horses were going for a trip to the forest. And he directed the driver to go to a particular spot. And there was known to be a quite dangerous area in the forest, and everyone would avoid it. But the Baal Shem Tov wanted to go there. And they arrived at the designated spot. The Baal Shem Tov climbs off the wagon, and within moments, to the chagrin of the driver, he's surrounded by several thieves. When the head of the band of thieves saw that it was the Baal Shem Tov, he was a known individual. He put down his weapon and he said, Holy Rabbi, what are you doing here in the wild? This is not a place for you. So the Baal Shem Tov said, I need to speak with you. I need your help. You need my help? I need your help. I need you to gather together 10 of your best thieves and bring them to me. 10 of my best thieves, that's what I need. 10 of your best thieves. Okay. He gathers together 10. And the Baal Shem Tov says to them, listen here, I need a favor from you. It's not for me. It's for a child who's the son of a widow whose father just passed away. I need the 10 of you to pray for his recovery, but to really mean it, to be intense in your prayers, the 10 of you together. They were first like, wow, this man believes in us, in our prayers, and we're thieves, we're lowlives, and yet he wants us to pray. And they took it seriously. And the child miraculously recovered. So later on, the Baal Shem Tov was asked by his surprised students, how does this make any sense? You gather together 10 of the holiest people in the world to pray for this child, nothing doing. You gather together 10 thieves, they pray for the child, and he's healed. So the Baal Shem Tov said, when I traveled to the heavenly world with my 10 holy partners, I saw that all the gates in heaven were locked. I needed people that know how to break in. They know how to break in. So I went to them. And there's a powerful message here. There's that thief within us, so to say, the part within us that we're perhaps embarrassed about. But there's a power to it. There's a power to it that when we turn that part around, that its prayers, the prayers from that part within our soul, is far more intense and far more powerful. That's the chips of the story of the 10 tablets, the parts that we step upon, Akev, the parts that we step upon with our heel. I know I'm running a little bit late, but I want to put up on the screen the text that we're going to be studying from here on forth. As I mentioned in my email, I find these texts so powerful. These are just a few sentences from Moses from the end of chapter 15. Trust me when I say, as we go through these verses right now, I'm going to read all the verses to you. It will take us months to go through it. Maybe not months, but definitely a month, maybe 2 months. We'll see. But there's no need to rush through them because they are so powerful indeed. So let's see if I can figure out how to share this with you. I hope it's up there on your screen. It's chapter 10, verse 12. We'll start from there. And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? I'm tempted to stop every sentence and talk, but I won't. We'll save that for next week. Right now, just the text of the Bible. Only to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to worship the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. To keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command you this day for your God. Behold, to the Lord your God belong the heaven and the heavens of the heavens, the earth and all that is on it. Only your forefathers, the Lord, desired to love them, and he chose their seed after them out of all peoples, as it is this day. You shall circumcise the foreskin of your heart, therefore, and be no more stiff-necked. For the Lord your God is God of gods and the Lord of the lords, the great and mighty, awesome God, who will show no favor, nor will he take a bribe. He executes the judgment of the orphan and the widow, and he loves the stranger to give him bread and clothing. You shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God, worship him, and cleave to him, and swear by his name. He is your praise, and he is your God, who did these great and awesome things for you, which your eyes have seen. I want to wish all of you a very good week. It should be a safe week for everyone, a healthy week for everyone. You're all welcome to join me Fridays at 2 o'clock, where I do a pre-Shabbat sermon here on Zoom. Monday evenings at 7:30, we're studying the story of Noah in our Biblical Reflections course. If you need Zoom links, simply go to jewishacademy.com/weekly. And if you go there, all the links for anything we're offering during the week are found over there. Have a wonderful week, everybody. Thanks for joining.